Hi everybody, this is Hero from the Birds back with another Shadowlands video. In this video we're going to take a look at a tier list for next raid from a world first raiding perspective. This is just a guess at what I anticipate world first raiding guilds will look at when they're selecting the specs from fight to fight in the next tier of content. Again, I define a world first raiding guild as a guild that's aiming to complete all the content obviously as quickly as possible. Most of us are trying to do that. But these people are trying to do it usually within the first week or two of the launch. So there's a great deal of excellent cutting edge guilds, those that maybe even raid for maybe only 3 or 4 weeks. But I'm thinking specifically of the kinds of guilds that are able to master the content without a significant revolution in gear, meaning they get serious upgrades that allow them at the mythic level of gear to complete mythic level content. So world first races are amazing to watch because you get to see unfolding in real time a lot of cool tactical choices, a lot of the strategies that many guilds use to complete the content at a later date are often born in world first raiding, and in the last little bit it's become something of an exciting moment from an entertainment perspective, as a lot of guilds look to stream it so you get a bit more of an inside look on what it's like to be in a raiding guild. I think it's all excellent stuff, and I look forward to it just as great content to consume. So there's a lot of excellent raiding guilds on either side of the pond, whether you are in North America or you are over in Europe, and it's kind of gone back and forth the last little bit. And in this tier list, what I'm trying to represent is a couple of things. First of all, a baseline level, what I've called the raid buff representatives. These are the specs that I think are most likely from fight to fight to be selected to be at least the one class that has to be there for the raid buff to get covered. The raid buffs, of course, coming from our mage and our warrior, and we consider usually warlocks a kind of raid buff because they have health stones and then gateways, which tend to be pretty useful, sometimes mandatory. Paladins give us a Devo aura, priests give us fortitude, and then we have the two debuffs, the magical debuff and the physical debuff coming from demon hunters and monks. So that first line just represents probably the ideal class, or the class most likely to at least be present for the raid buffs. Now, what's interesting about this kind of a selection is sometimes it's better for a tank to represent some of these things, and sometimes it's better for a DPS or a healer. I guess it's kind of awkward. In some senses, you could get the Mistweaver, for example, to cover the monk debuff. But Mistweavers, even though they are in melee hitting things, aren't necessarily covering all of the targets, so they're not necessarily running across the map to catch a group of ads. So it's actually, generally speaking, a little bit unlikely that you have only a Mistweaver in a raid to cover the monk, but you could do that if you wanted to. My sense is the strength of Brewmaster's kit coming in the next tier, specifically once they get access to their 4-piece and have a bit more damage profile from Keg Smash, and they just have good solid damage coming out of this previous tier anyways, single target specifically. You'll see, I'm guessing, Brewmaster fill up one of the tank slots, unless there's a special need for other tanks. The other tank that's doing incredible amounts of damage is actually Paladin, so that's why it's listed here on the list. But just to reiterate, in the raid buff representative spot, you have what I think of are the ideal classes, and here's why. Fury Warriors, their kit just seems to be a little better for the 4-piece, whereas Arms is going to struggle to make use of it to the same degree. Going into next tier, Fury is showing pretty strong on a lot of the sims that we see, and it's a pretty solid class. It's got good survivability compared to Arms. You could have Arms, and there'll be a niche case here to be made for why Arms might show up in the raid in a little bit, but for now I have them there because you're going to need one warrior to cover that buff, and it's unlikely to be Prot Warrior. Prot Warrior stuff seems to be a little bit lackluster as far as simming the damage side of tanks. So because even though, Prot Warrior historically has been an execute tank that you want to bring along because they have the best execute, but Paladin has surpassed them in that regard, and even Brewmaster to some degree is pumping out more single target damage. Mage is obviously on the list. I have Fire Mage here in this slot. It could be Frost, but I think Fire is just the better spec given the combustion shenanigans we're probably likely to see again in the next tier. So I've selected them. I think their 4-piece just seems to work much better with the double legendary setup. You'll have probably a lot of Fire Mages, is my guess, in the next tier alongside Boomkins, filling out a lot of the ranged raid roster. And then the same actually is kind of true for demo locks, though I think there's some niche cases for Destro. Doesn't mean Affliction's bad. In fact, it might be okay. I'm just guessing that most Warlocks are going to begin from a demonology perspective. The consistency of Tyrants, the 4-piece just synergizing really well with having extra minions on the field. They're probably going to be just gigantic pumpers. And it's actually kind of a mobile class. If you think about what demo locks offer, in fact, Affliction Lock is probably less mobile than we think because of the nature of their filler compared to how fast you can fire off Hand of Gul'dan's. And again, I'll get to Destro, but I've just got Demo up here as probably clearly in the Sims at least ahead and so likely to fill that role of at least one Warlock. But my guess is, as history has shown in the past, we'll have far more Warlocks in the raid than that. Holy Paladin, it's probably no surprise that they're going to be the ones likely to bring the buff, although I think Prot Paladin is just good enough that it could be fine, but Holy Paladin is just here as a marker because, frankly, it's really hard for healer comps to get away from this kit. It actually really has nothing to do with relative throughput of healers in a raid. Healing is an important part, and Prot Paladin's throughput, generally speaking, is not insane compared to what others could offer in just raw HPS. If you think about Holy Priests, even Resto Druid's raw HPS is actually pretty good. But the damage reduction, this is always what we're talking about, and it's true for the beginning of next tier as well. DR is just a massive deal. You start with less health because you don't have mythic gear on when you enter and you start with a need for big ticket immunities. So Prot Paladin brings that as well, actually, but Holy Paladin giving us an extra bop to work with. It has its own personal immunity. It's pretty sturdy with a 20% DR, and then Devo Aura is an excellent coverage because you don't have to be stacked, so it works on pretty much any encounter. I think Disc Priest is probably likely to show up at least a little bit, so I have it here as the raid buff rep holder. I don't see Holy Priest being used to overtake it because there's likely going to be another actor on the field to do the heavy throughput lifting, and that's Mistweaver Monk for next tier is my guess. But you're going to need a priest to give us stamina, and I think Shadow Priest is fine. So you might see just the Shadow Priest do it, and if they have certain comps where you can drop a healer, you're probably going to drop your Disc Priest, run something like double Holy Paladin, Mistweaver, and I'm guessing Resto Shaman, something like that for a link. But Disc Priest is still valuable because there's going to be a lot of moments in the later encounters, we haven't even seen them, to be honest, where you're going to be thinking about, can we ignore or absorb an entire mechanic with Spirit Shell? And if the answer at least twice a fight or at two really important parts in a fight is yes, then the changes to Disc Priest probably don't matter. The fact that it's been propped up in some regard by needing innervates still doesn't matter. It's just such a useful spec to have in your arsenal if you're doing world first rating. Again, increasing the health pool artificially to absorb a specific encounter is great. So Disc Priest is there as my raid buff rep. I think Havoc DH is simming quite nicely. It looks like a spec that's going to see a return, at least a one of. Melee is always a tricky place to put your hopes and dreams if you're a raider, because historically we just haven't had very many slots for them, due in part to what we were talking about right here. This raid buff representation is a requirement before you even get to talking about what specs can be brought. But I do think unless Vengeance Demon Hunter stays like extremely overpowered in single target, its Immolation Aura was doing some crazy nonsense, so maybe they don't entirely nerf that or gut it. I think they probably will. But Demon, we'll put just Havoc in there for the rep spot for that. Kind of like where Windwalker Monk was last. So whereas we didn't necessarily carry a Brewmaster Monk, we preferred to have a Windwalker, even though Windwalker is in the single target isn't isn't that great. Its cleave is and AoE is the real strong point. I think like that, DH is going to have some solid single target, but I don't think it's going to be top of the charts. It will be providing that debuff. That's amazing. And as I mentioned, Brewmaster Monk for our Monk debuff. Tanks. Now here's what I've got for the rest of the list. These are the ones that I think are going to be probably played at some point in the World First race. And from left to right, we have most likely to be played and very often, down to perhaps niche or played in a few encounters, but likely not all the time. And then everything else I've just taken right off the list to clean it up, because I don't see how any of the other specs will surpass the utility and quality of the specs that are listed above. It may be that you have, in certain circumstances, an MM Hunter or an LE Shaman or a guy who's amazing at Frost Mage but can't play Fire Mage. There may be that sort of situation on a select few World First rating guilds, but it's kind of unlikely. My guess is you will see stacking of a couple of the classes that are on the far left banner, specifically the ranged ones. I don't know if the melee ones need to be stacked because we don't have that many slots. But this is my take on World First rating. So, tanks. First of all, I think Prot Paladin's going to have a staple position. Just its ability to offer specific immunities to different kinds of damage. So it can nullify both completely a magic event with its spell warding, or just another bop like our Holy Paladin. Also, Prot Paladin with Venthyr specifically and access to Mad Paragon now is probably just going to do crazy amounts of damage, especially if they don't change Ashen Hallow. They look like they're going to nerf it, but it seems like they're bringing it back. Anyways, I see Prot Paladin as continuing forward. Just immense utility, ability to control variables like that is pretty essential for especially the last portions of a boss. You think of Lich King, and the ability to spell ward off the last phases was kind of essential, and that's only offered by something like Prot Paladin. I don't think it's like an exceptional deal if you didn't have a Prot Paladin, but my guess is that World First Raiders will have one queued up to be in most of the encounters. Blood DK is the other one, though this is, I think, a little more niche. It's just the only other spec that offers something kind of unique outside of just more damage, meaning we get grips. So we saw that last encounter where on, what was it? It was not Painsmith, it's the other one with Garrosh, chained up Soul Man, or I forget. Anyways, we gripped all the ads together in the phase and blasted them down, and one of the most efficient ways to do that was just to have Death Knights doing either their Necrolord ability to grip everything in with the cool hands that go flying out, or doing their mass grip. So that's probably going to happen in some of the mythic strategies, I'm guessing, at some point in the race. So I can see this being there for at least 3 or 4, because there seem to be a lot of AoE heavy ad moments, and I'm sure World First Raiders are just going to prefer a strategy that in maybe 2-minute intervals lines all those things up, brings them together, and allows maybe a Windwalker, maybe other classes to just completely blow things up. On the healer side, I think Mistweaver is the other really important healer to watch out for. Its stocks are rising, and people are kind of testing it out right now. If you look at some reclears, if you look at Warcraft logs, and kind of check out what's been going on in the last few weeks. And that's partly because their access to another legendary allows them to align 2 really powerful legendaries. They had the Ancient Teachings, which is kind of your super fist weaving style, and you have the Fallen Order Monks one, which is just a doubling down on the Venthyr playstyle. And when you put those together, they don't have like direct synergy, but they were both exceptionally strong, and it essentially, with high haste, allows Mistweaver to pump out immense amounts of throughput with very little effort. You just do the little rushing wind around you, and you essence font, and then you just kick Rising Sun kick to keep everything rocking and rolling. And it's a pretty accessible playstyle, and it just pumps a lot of numbers, guys. If you're thinking about raw throughput, and I think every roster is going to want one class that they know is you're just a throughput class. This is a rot damage fight. We just need you in here. Bang, off you go. But it might even be just enough that they do so much more healing than either Holy Paladin, even though Holy Paladin adds a lot of damage passively, or Disc Priest similarly. They just don't care. Like, we just need the healing, so they'll probably turn to a Mistweaver, is my guess, unless something changes. Resto Shaman is the other one. Mainly we're looking at Link, although there's other things that Resto Shaman offers, like Windrush Totem, a few other utilities. Maybe a kick is also nice, although in a raid it's usually not a problem. But Link specifically is sometimes just a game changer. It's often a game changer in the later portions of raids where you have overlapping mechanics that you cannot manage without some kind of health link, and this is the only class that offers it. So I could see, Holy Paladin, Mistweaver Monk, Resto Shaman as a starting lineup, and then maybe a Disc Priest in there for certain spots. They might flip out with the Mistweaver, or maybe vice versa with one of the Paladins, something like that. Okay, ranged. Here's where it gets interesting. I've listed far more melee DPS than ranged DPS, and that's a problem. It's strange. There's usually more range slots, but in fact, we tend to go back to very similar categories for what range classes are going to be really good. And I could have put Elemental Shaman up here as well, probably as a niche, and though that's only because, in my view, Elemental Shaman or Shaman in general has access to quite a few different combinations. And one of the exciting parts about this coming raid is we are now unlocking all of the covenants, meaning if you wanted to be Kyrian, you could do so with the flip of a switch. And what you'll see raiders doing, especially as we move through into bosses 6, 7, 8, and then up to the last few, is they will be selecting not just a demo warlock, they're going to be selecting a Night Fae demo warlock. Now, some specs are likely to just stick with one camp because it's going to be overpowered given the double legendaries or the 4-piece. But some specs, like a Shaman, have a little more wiggle room, and they'll probably be moving from fight to fight to fight. Do you need spread cleave? Do you need single target burst? Do you need burst AoE? These kinds of questions, right? So Elemental Shaman, or Shaman more generally, have had quite a wide range in terms of their profile. They might show up as well, but I expect to see Boomkin stacked again. They really have not addressed the amazing scaling that it gets, and in fact, a lot of Covenant options are opening. Kyrian a little bit. You can bless somebody else basically, and everyone goes crazy. That's useful, but maybe even just Night Fae is fine again with 1 minute Convoke, and we're just blasting things. And guys, it's the beginning of a tier, so we're working with data from last tier. We don't necessarily have our 4-piece yet. What's wrong with regular Venthyr Boomkin? Like, these options all seem kind of reasonable, and they haven't really gutted Boomkin damage yet. And there's going to be a lot of fights with really, really long ways to go, so you can see Boomkins getting to adds while still clipping and multi-dotting. They're kind of really well suited for it, even compared to something like S-Priest, which has a very complicated rotation once you include multi-dotting. I can't see Boomkins being ever not on the list, and I see them being stacked quite significantly. S-Priest is probably really good in single target, especially if you have a lot of ranged adds. I think the Anduin fight seemed to suggest something that might be useful for the multi-dotting side of S-Priest, which can perhaps funnel away from adds into other targets, that kind of thing. So I think they may have a place, and their damage seems okay from the Sims. The other main one I think I want to talk about as far as a range class you want to stack is potentially Destro Lock for very specific fights. Again, the Anduin fight, if you're trying to get Havoc cleave, Destro Lock really does it better than anyone else. They fixed their 2-piece, 4-piece, and it looks like it's going to be more consistent now. So it's the sort of thing that you can pencil in the margin. But the thing, like with mages, is you're always going to have multiple warlocks in the raid, and if they could go between all 3 of these specs, you're going to have a spot one way or the other because you need the raid buff, and they're just quite good. But I can see Destro coming in any sort of cleave or council fight, coming ahead of demo and probably even of AF, just because of the burst profile with Havoc and all that kind of stuff. So we'll have to see. I'm not sure if the numbers are quite there for Destro compared to demo, but I think there's a niche case for them. What about hunters? What about Beastmaster hunters? What about MM? MM's still probably fine. Beastmaster's probably fine. I don't think it offers us something that's really more compelling or niche compared to this. That's all I'm talking about. Is you might see them in World First Rating. I'm just sketching out what I think are the kind of bare parameters that they'll have to cover or think through when making some of these choices. Yeah, you arcane mages, you're going to be pumpers. Don't worry. I just don't think it's going to be better than the access of Fire Mage. It can move. It's got execute. I'm sorry. Melee. All right. So in the melee, we already have Fury Warrior. That's kind of representative. He's going to be up there. Probably Havoc DH. So that's 2 slots. How many slots do we have left for melee? We got 2 tanks. That's 4. What do we got? 2 slots left? Maybe 3? It's a tough one for melee, isn't it? Okay, so here's what I think. Probably Assassination Rogue, maybe Sub Rogue are going to be excellent in single target. They usually are, and their kits don't really give anything else except for extended damage, so it's not an extra complicated rotation suddenly, although maybe Assassination Rogues have to figure out how to press Rupture a little more often because their bleeds are going to fall off in that window. I don't know. They can figure it out. It's still quite good scaling as they get more secondary stats because Assassination pumps, and if you look at the auto attack damage of that class, with Slice and Dice, it's immense. So I expect to see at least one Assassination Rogue. Rogues are also just great for immunity stuff, right? Cloak is amazing. They're really sturdy with Feint. It's always a great melee class if you have to choose melee classes. But I think Sub might be good too with Akari. I don't know if it's going to be better than Assassination. Specifically, I think Ventir's version of Assassination, though maybe I've kind of lost track and we're now back on Night Fae. I don't know exactly, but the Sims are good. Survival Hunter with WFI. Seems like it might be strong. Obviously a little more geared to AoE or burst AoE, but if the Sims are right, if hero damage guy is right, and people doing all the rotational stuff is correct, then the 4-piece represents a kind of return to the bomb style of play, and it's probably reasonable in single target. Does that mean you would bring it? I actually don't know. It's just I have it up here because the numbers right now are scaled so crazy right out the wazoo that even if you had a cleave situation, I think survival WFI, Wildfire Bomb, and Wildfire Infusion is really, really strong. So I expect to see some representation of survival hunters at least test it out in a world first rating. I don't know if they'll finally be the choice. My guess is something more traditional like warriors will start to fill back up, especially if we have in the end bosses a true execute, which we didn't have with Sylvanas, which is we still saw warriors playing. I guess they're playing Night Fae a little bit more for the upfront crit, but my guess is if there are true execute moments, you might start to see more warriors coming back in. But don't count out survival. It seems like an interesting class, and I would not be surprised to see one. Feral Druids, giant pumpers. They scale really well, given the access to secondaries, and the double legendaries looks promising for them. I don't know if they're going to be selected. If you've got Boomkins, then why are you bringing Feral? You know what I mean? So I just have them on here because there's an outlier that they might just do obscene amounts of single target damage, and that's what you need. So you just backfill your raid with a couple of Ferals, but I have it on here mostly as a representative of how much better just pure damage from Feral is compared to something like potentially Unholy or Frost DK, which just don't seem to have, or Windwalker in single target, for example, that don't really have much representation. Maybe Ret's okay, actually. I didn't really think through Ret entirely. Their pieces are somewhat decent, but I just don't see it. And again, just to be clear, Assassination, Sub, Survival, Feral, they're not offering, maybe the Rogues a little bit, but we're not really offering anything to the raid that's a special utility that only they can bring and nobody else can. So these spots are always very tenuous, especially when you have a squeezed melee. Here's the combination of Warrior, Arms Warrior, and Enhancement Shaman is always an interesting game. If you look up Enhancement Shaman charts for who takes advantage of their Wind Fury totem the best, it is by like, I don't know, a multiplier of 2 or 3 Arms Warrior, something like significant improvement in the damage profile, like 10% extra damage or something for Arms Warriors who are in a Wind Fury group. And the reason for that's pretty straightforward. The only way for Arms Warrior to generate their resource rage is by auto attacking or charging. There's a few other things that allow you, like there's one talent, Skullbreaker or something. I don't think anyone plays it. But the point is that if you have an execute focused type of fight where you got to kill it, or you're going to die, and there's at least one of them that we know of. The value of Arms Warrior goes up significantly because they have free access to an unmitigated execute. It doesn't have a cooldown like Fury does. And if they can generate the Rage, which I think given double legendaries and maybe access to things like if you want to play Necrolord, you get a pretty good Rage gen. Even Kyrian gives you a pretty significant Rage bump in those periods, so their Rage troubles are a little bit less over the course of a whole fight. Then they might be okay. Like, Arms Warriors might slap. Combine this with the fact that they're now going to have probably an Enduring Blow, which is when they hit their Mortal Strike, they have a chance to produce their DR button on the target with Colossus Smash, which is huge damage amp for the Arms Warrior. So they can get that alongside whatever Rage generation bonus they get out of their secondary, or maybe just passive damage. It looks like Arms Warrior might be a thing. And if it might be a thing, then it's almost guaranteed you'll have an enhancement shaman as part of a group. So usually you'll see, if Arms Warrior is a thing, you'll usually see 2 or 3 of them, and you'll have an enhanced shaman, and then whoever else can benefit from the Wind Fury totem. And the reason for this is because it's a really, really strong impetus to have multiple Arms Warriors taking advantage of it, because it's like a 10% increase in damage. And if you have multiple executes going on, that phase of the fight is even quicker than if you just had the one. So it kind of scales really nicely. Anyways, I'm not sure if Arms is going to make it out, though. If they're going to really, really suppress Fury just overall. I think the tools are a little bit better for Fury because they can now, if you're a Venthyr, you can sustain your main CD Recklessness basically 100% of the time, whereas Venthyr for Arms still struggles a lot with Rage, so there's not really a serious mechanism for letting them condemn to extend Recklessness. Fury has access to all kinds of things, talents, conduits, legendaries that keep Recklessness pretty much up 100% of the time. So that's why I see that being a little bit different. Obviously, these other ones could have factored in. We could have had Frost Mages up here and talked about how great they are in AoE and stuff. I just don't see it, guys. If you're in the raid, you're likely to play fire. You could talk about Vengeance Demon Hunters and being insane, and again, they don't offer you something except for maybe an AoE silence that is going to do the same type of work that a Blood DK could do potentially, and unless the damage profile is better than a Prot Paladin and a Brewmaster, or you definitely need the debuff because Havoc just sucks on a fight, then we likely won't see Demon Hunter in there as well. Those are my thoughts, guys, on making tier lists. Begin by thinking about the raid buffs. Think about what kind of slots you have left over for your melee and which ones might be best suited. I think it's going to be an exciting race. As I said, it's really one of the best parts of WoW, a new, as it were, season coming out and people rushing to get into this content. We have that exceptional part about this race. We don't really know what the last 3 bosses are like. The testing for it hasn't really happened. And I imagine they will continue to withhold that from us so that World First Raiders get the first crack at seeing what those mythic mechanics are like. That's always exciting because you see them thinking about tactics. You see them thinking about personnel, strategies, specs, what they bring to the table. So a list like this helps us to identify some of those pieces. And if you are kind of getting into raiding and interested in it, I would suggest begin by looking at especially the raid buff representatives. Can you play any of these specs or their representatives? So Frost Mage maybe is relevant here too. If you can play a Warlock or a Mage, a Fire Mage, or a Warlock, or a Holy Paladin, or a Disc Priest, you're likely always to find a spot in raiding. So start here, and if you absolutely hate all these classes, then look somewhere else. But other than that, guys, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy. We'll see you again next time.